Did you know that Lex Luthor is a bad guy? Because apparently, some people didn't. Some people started doing that thing they do where they talk about whether or not Jesse Eisenberg was a good Lex Luthor. And look, he doesn't have to be your favorite, but it's really silly, some of the things people say about him. So some people were discussing Jesse Eisenberg, and they were talking about how he's a Silicon Valley, Bezos, Zuckerberg, Musk tech mogul type who is poking fun at Max Landis nepotism stuff based on Silver Age mad scientist stuff, complete with hair, and has touches of Azarella's Lex Luthor from Man of Steel. So their hate is clearly manufactured. Personally, I would add on that he's clearly based on Superman Birthright by Mark Waid, and bears many similarities to actually the way that Michael Rosenbaum's Lex Luthor is portrayed. Michael Rosenbaum's Lex Luthor threw way more temper tantrums, was way more emotional, and in the worst case of writing ever, also dated a high school student. We just kind of ignore that, I guess. It was a different time. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago, though, so that's weird, you know? Anyway, this man with a ridiculous... if you imagine like a neckbeard woe jacket, he just looks like that. And his rebuttal was, Lex Luthor isn't a Silicon Valley Bezos Zuckerberg Musk type. He's a cold, calculating genius businessman who exudes quiet power and gravitas. He's physically imposing and possesses a malevolent aura. Jesse didn't.
Oh! No, the other thing. Come on, I know it's just dangling off the tip of your tongue.
Superman will never...
WRONG!
And look, we could argue that Jesse did have a intimidating, malevolent aura. I mean, he literally had Congress people eating out of his hand. He bombed people. He made monsters. He controlled everything around him. He was intimidating. He had Superman on his knees doing his bidding. In his first ever attempt to start a fight with Superman, he successfully kills him. Not bad. I think arguably makes him the most successful Lex Luthor. But I want to circle back to the verbiage this individual uses. So let's circle back. How does he describe Lex? A cold, calculating genius businessman who exudes quiet power and gravitas, physically imposing, possesses a malevolent aura. Some of you may have already picked up on the fact that this is very romanticized language, and that's because he's fetishized the idea of Lex Luthor. You see, Lex Luthor is a bad guy, but some people really like watching him be a bad guy. They like the tough businessman in a suit who can command all of the women in the room to do whatever they want. And that's not the point of Lex Luthor. You're supposed to hate him. And look, I understand liking the in-control businessman type. I watched countless seasons of the show Suits. I love Harvey Specter. But Harvey Specter was a good guy, and Lex Luthor is not. I mean, that's a fundamental difference. And narratively, they serve entirely different purposes. And it feels as though Henry here is idolizing the wrong figure between the Superman and Lex Luthor thing. And if that was all he said, I would say maybe it was just poor word choice in the moment, but he continues on. He says Lex Luthor is always calm, calculating, and above all, controlled. He says Lex Luthor is an imposing man in a business suit with a deep and commanding voice. When confronted by a reporter, he doesn't take the bait. He calmly says, "Mercy, bring the car around. This interview is at an end." So again, that's more of his sort of power fantasy that he's playing out through Clancy Brown's Lex Luthor, which he's clearly trying to reference, because that's a very schlocky fanfic interpretation of how Clancy Brown's Lex Luthor spoke. But here's the thing. Comic books don't have a voice. And they also don't have a performance. You have still frames of how they act, and you extrapolate and interpret what happens in between those frames, using the narration boxes, using the text boxes, and just kind of, there's a shared language and almost like a rhythm that's shared between artist, inker, colorist, and consumer. And that's how we sort of extrapolate this whole idea of what the performance might be. And that's why there's so many different interpretations of a comic book character, even if you're looking at the same source material, right? Because for some people it's like, oh, well, he meant this in like a sarcastic way, or a cruel way, or a sincere way, and there's a bunch of different ways to read that. So, which is true? I mean, you could argue the original script for the comic holds the most truth, so maybe the writer, but then maybe the artist does something and the writer likes that more. So maybe now there's a different meaning. They've revised it. Or maybe years later they look back on it and they feel differently about it themselves as the people who made it. So which is true, their original intent or how they feel about it now with more time and maturity? I don't know. Many famous writers like Frank Miller and Alan Moore have talked about how they look back on their old stuff and they're like, I wouldn't have done it that way. I would have changed it. So does that mean that we should ignore their old work? Probably not. Does it mean we should ignore what they feel now? Also probably not. There is no one way to do these characters. And it's this lie that this is the way I interpret it. It must be the way everyone interprets it. I am the gold standard by which all fans are graded on. And there's no other potential alternative to this. I'm just better than everyone because I have a headcanon for a fictional businessman, and that makes me better than everyone else, so I should talk down to them. I just think it's silly because the comments that started all of this on the Inside of You podcast with Michael Rosenbaum, specifically with James Gunn in this episode, people assumed that it was all attacking Jesse Eisenberg, but in reality, James Gunn was poking fun at Gene Hackman, because he doesn't like Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor. And he's never liked his performance in those movies. So by the way, all of you Trunk supporters who think you're getting a Chris Reeve clone, you're in for a hell of a surprise when you get a very different Lex Luthor. Gene Hackman was none of the things that this Henry guy's describing. He lost his composure plenty, he screamed, he threw temper tantrums, he was cartoony, he was over the top, he didn't have a deep commanding voice, he had like a regular guy voice. And he also wasn't bald for like any of the movies. He's bald in like 2 scenes. He has hair again in the second movie. Dude has hair. He's not, the standard Lex people know of in the 21st century, right? The movie was made 50 years ago. So, not shocking, but no one busts his balls for it, probably because he's like 90. Michael Rosenbaum, also not a comic book Lex. I mean, arguably you could say he's similar to the Mark Waid comic book, but that Mark Waid comic, I'm pretty sure came after Smallville. So, and also as a kid, I didn't care because I knew that it was a new interpretation and that didn't bother me at all. Not once did I get upset that Bizarro was just Tom Welling with like a Photoshop filter on his face. I was like, yeah, okay, that's what they're doing. It doesn't erase the comics I like or the cartoons I watched. Like, I was not able to drive a car and I clearly had more maturity than this guy. John Cryer from the Supergirl show, which everyone forgets about, which is why I never assumed that James Gunn was insulting him, because I don't think James Gunn remembered that John Cryer played Lex Luthor, frankly. John Cryer was fine, definitely not a deep, intimidating voice, and definitely more prone to temper tantrums as his performance, and it wasn't a bad performance, it was still very Lex Luthor. Kevin Spacey, a lot of things wrong with that guy. His ability to play Lex Luthor wasn't one of them. He screams, he's all over the place, he's a cartoon character. I mean, really, the thing that it seems like he's holding on to is the DC animated Lex Luthor by Clancy Brown, who was literally a cartoon character, who had very childish ambitions because it was made for children. They couldn't do some of the things the writers wanted to do because of censorship, and because when you're making something for a child, you kind of have to soften the edges, and, there's things that happen in certain comics you can't do in TV for children, especially in the 90s. So, I don't quite understand this. None of the things he's saying truly apply to Lex in any one regard. No one Lex embodies all of that, and even if they did, you shouldn't look up to Lex Luthor, and that's kind of the big takeaway point here. These people are like, Lex Luthor should be strong and confident and bold and command a room and tell women what to do and get everything he wants and always be smarter than Superman, and after a while, it's clear they're rooting for the wrong guy. I guess today's lesson is, there is no Lex Luthor that fits the way most of these people sort of caricaturize them. Not characterize, caricature, as in to exaggerate features and ignore others. That's not real. That's just a memory of a memory of a memory that someone had when they were a child, and their adult brain has some type of cognitive wall that won't allow them to reassess the character. And Lex Luthor, for those of you just now paying attention, is not the good guy. You aren't supposed to root for him. He's not supposed to be likable. Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor is awesome because he successfully kills Superman in his first go. He's actually smarter than everyone else in the room, not just You don't just hear that in dialogue. They don't just say, he's the smartest man alive, and then he tells someone the weakness of his allies. He's actually smart, and he starts off as an amalgam of all these real-world figures that we should be dubious of, and morphs into the Lex Luthor we know by the end of that movie, and especially by the time we see him in Justice League, either version, where he's this bald, confident, strong guy that this dude was clearly romanticizing about, who's staring down a mercenary, poking fun at him, completely unwavered, right? Like, Superman came back from the dead and fought an alien and won 20 minutes ago, and he's like, yeah, whatever, I'll just kill him again. No big deal. Like, he's unwavered and, like, unaffected by it. In fact, there's this really great description that I'll leave you with of the way that Jesse's portrayed. That amalgam of real-world characters is also still very much based on the original mad scientist, businessman versions of Lex Luthor, where he had the hair and where he was sort of a over-the-top character. He would have been like that anyway, because that's the way Siegel and Schuster had him. And those guys got screwed over by DC really hard and died broke and penniless. So believe me when I tell you that they would 100% support taking shots at real-world corrupt businessmen so that people like them don't get screwed over in the future. Alright? So here's the description of Batman vs. Superman Lex Luthor that I think sums it up better than I possibly could. Comic fans get confused by Lex because the character is a legitimate super genius, mad scientist. It's very rare in these kinds of movies. Like in Avengers, the villain Loki is described as a full-tilt diva who's crazier than a bag of cats, but he doesn't actually do or say anything particularly crazy. His genius plan is to use brute force to become king of Earth. Eisenberg plays Lex like his overclocked brain is starting to melt. He's ranting about the Trix rabbit while the UFO he hosed gives birth to a nightmare version of his abusive father, which he hopes will literally kill God. And there's actually a perverse logic to it, because he wins. So yeah, Lex Luthor. As soon as you think of him as being so smart, it's actually like difficult to exist, because he's like sort of like how Clark is overwhelmed by his senses. Lex is overwhelmed by his own brilliance. Then he goes to Arkham.
Heard you were a few clowns short of a circus.
I was. Thank you. Until the good doctors at Arkham helped me find some much-needed clarity. Now, you volunteered to destroy the Bat free of charge.
And he gets help, and he actually gets better. There were supposed to be like 4 or so movies there where Lex would have been that Lex Luthor we know. That Lex Luthor that you sort of expect, right? And now we would know how he got there. We would have tipped our hat to the past and embraced the future. But you guys cut him off before he could, really hit the stride, and then blamed him for it. When it took Spider-Man like 5 movies to make his own costume that was actually good, and no one bats an eye at that crap. You see how different that is? Like, if we look at Marvel and we look at DC and we look at the whole comic accuracy complaint, it's non-existent in the MCU. It's 100% over-existent in the DC movies, and most of the time people are saying it at things that are actually taken from comics they just didn't read or like. Which is why comic accuracy is a stupid, nonsensical term. It's a moving target, and it's completely f***ing worthless in a conversation. Man, I've read comic runs with the same writer and artist across the entirety of it, and even they can't keep it consistent. Comic writers like Grant Morrison, like Dan Jurgens, whose comics Zach adapted, have gone on record saying they love the way that these comics were adapted and elaborated on in a feature-length film runtime. So, again, back to that original conversation. Who knows best if the comic is well adapted or the original intent of it? Is it the writer? Because if so, the complaints about Zack Snyder, whoosh, out the window. And even if you still don't like Zack Snyder, it's undeniable that the things he was doing were done before, and that the way people talk about Lex is wildly inaccurate. Thanks for listening to a video that went longer than I expected. Remember, these are fictional characters, so if you don't like the way one of them was in a movie 8 years ago, just move on with your life and shut up about it. It's a completely different thing between talking about something you love for years and years after the fact, and whining about something you didn't like in a movie for over a decade. One of them is passion. One of them is a mental disorder. Go touch some grass. Have a nice day. Get some vitamin D. Lex Luthor's the bad guy. End of story.